Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a new event organized by the Observatorio de la Lengua Española y las Culturas Hispánicas en los Estados Unidos. The Camino de Santiago is probably one of the most important and transcendental pieces of Spain's cultural heritage, and for the past few decades, it has developed a special and close connection with the US, where there are now, I've read, more than 50 institutions devoted to studying and promoting the Camino within North American society. 2021 is what we call in Spanish un año jacobeo, or año jacobeo in Galician, or Holy Year, when St. James's Day, July the 25th, falls on a Sunday, which normally happens every 5 or 6 years, sometimes more. And it is a real honor to celebrate this Año Jacobeo at this research center of the Instituto Cervantes at Harvard University, with one of the most prestigious, knowledgeable, and respected North American pilgrims, not just in the US, but in Galicia, indeed in the whole of Spain, and in many other parts of the world, George Greenia, whom I am really happy to introduce to you all. Professor George Greenia retired in 2016 after more than 30 years teaching full-time at William & Mary, where he's now Professor Emeritus. His areas of specialization are the languages, literatures, and cultural history of medieval Iberia from the 16th century through the 15th century, also pilgrimage studies, medieval book culture, and the archaeology of manuscript book, manuscript illuminations, and linguistics. He's still publishing widely on most of these topics. For many years, he was editor of the journal La Crónica, devoted to medieval Iberia, and he is co-editor of a 2-volume encyclopedia on Castilian writers from the 13th to the 16th centuries. In 2007, Professor Greenia was named Editor of the Year by the Council of Editors of Learned Journals. Professor Greenia served for 10 years as director of William & Mary's program in medieval and Renaissance studies, and in 2011, he founded the William & Mary Institute for Pilgrimage Studies, which a few years later created research fellowships named in his honor. And starting a few years back, he guided William & Mary undergraduates in retracing the legendary routes of the Camino de Santiago across northern Iberia. So you won't be surprised to hear that Professor Greenia has been honored 3 times by William & Mary for outstanding faculty service to the community and for his promotion of Spanish culture in the United States. In 2007, Professor Greenia was knighted by King Juan Carlos of Spain and granted the encomienda de la Orden de Isabel la Católica. He's a co-founding member of the International Fraternity of the Camino de Santiago, which is headquartered in Santiago de Compostela in Spain. And he was inducted by cathedral officials as a member of the Archconfraternity of the Apostle St. James. In 2010, the Concejo de la Enxebre Orden de la Vieira, a confraternity of Galicians in the diaspora, named him Ángel del Camino, Angel of the Way, which is very nice. In 2016, Professor Greenia was presented a Lifetime Achievement Award from American pilgrims on the Camino. And finally, more recently, in 2019, he was the recipient of the International Compostela Prize, a reward granted annually by the Compostela group of universities to a person or institution that has stood out due to work in favor of the dissemination of international projects and ideas, especially education and the preservation of our cultural heritage. So I'm really pleased and honored to welcome you to the Observatorio, Professor Greenia. Thank you very much indeed for accepting our invitation. You have a really large and selected audience today with colleagues, people who you know very well, as you have told me, like the archaeologist Jose Suarez Otero, Anne Bailey from Oxford, a historian from Oxford, Marian Dunn, editor of the Libro de Santi Jacobi, Henny the Necht, a celebrated photographer of the Camino, somebody from the Junta de Galicia, Manuel Rodriguez, the person in charge of the files of the cathedral in Santiago, Miguel José Sanchez, and José Sanchez and Miguel Taín Guzmán, who holds the chair of pilgrimage studies and the studies on the Camino in the University of Santiago de Compostela. So thank you everybody for your presence here, for joining us today. And you have the floor now, Professor Greenia.
That was such a generous introduction, Marta. Thank you. It's a great honor to be with you today. I'm glad there are so many knowledgeable people in the audience. They can answer all the questions I cannot answer. I may call on some of you to field some of the questions that come up later, but it's a great joy to be with you today and try to offer a few thoughts on the Camino de Santiago and world pilgrimage, because our expanse, our vision of what the Camino de Santiago has been and is becoming in the 21st century is truly vast. So if I can try to share my screen at this point. Do you have a full screen view?
Yep,
Great.
perfect.
Thank you. Now, this talk was postponed for several months in hopes of being able to join the Harvard community and learn from them. But COVID restrictions, unfortunately, are still preventing that. And frankly, flying anywhere these days is unpleasant. So this Zoom format is a blessing as well as a fallback. It allows us to the benefit of the presence of scholars from distant locations, experts, as we mentioned, like Jose Suarez Otero and Manuel Rodriguez from Santiago, William Griffiths from London and Malta, Miguel Taín from Santiago, and many others. Like most of you in the virtual audience, my connections to Hispanic culture crosses oceans and nationalities. I might as well go ahead and share with you that my mother was a Sephardic Jew of Spanish heritage, a native speaker of French from North Africa. As a boy, I rebelled and studied Spanish and Latin, coming to French only later in my career. There are good reasons for all of us internationalists to take a close look at the Camino de Santiago model during its double holy years, and as plans emerge for celebrating and expanding all sorts of pilgrimage across the world. Frankly, there's nothing to energize one for a major presentation like announcing the impossible, the Camino de Santiago and world pilgrimage. 50 years ago, describing the Camino de Santiago in a global context might have been a modest comparative exercise. The world has gotten smaller, more connected, and a will to travel has reached into a ballooning middle class from Argentina to China, from Serbia to Australia. Addressing religious tourism and pilgrimage also implies a special responsibility. People interested in travel for transcendence may expect a speaker to be transcendent as well, to be a reliable guide into other cultures, maybe other planes of existence. If you are the speaker, you know you will fall short. The good thing is that the same audience interested in transcendence is often in possession of wise intuitions of their own. They tend to be good listeners and gentle respondents. I really do look forward to what I will learn from you as well. So here's the punchline for this entire talk. I believe that the Camino de Santiago in Spain is not only a historical artifact turned into a modern success story, it has emerged as a prestige model for religious tourism and pilgrimage in a global context. The Camino has almost become a brand designation for transformative journeys. There are treks in Brazil announced as training pilgrimages for the Camino de Santiago in Spain. Ian McIntosh has documented that his native Australia now has 5 such walking journeys called Caminos, some merely recreational through national parks, but others undertaken in solidarity with Aboriginal Australian natives who first owned the lands appropriated by English settlers. These are journeys of reconciliation and even reparation. Matthew Anderson has helped inaugurate something similar in Canada across Western Plains territories, where Lakota and other First Nations were literally walked to death in exiles of extermination. Some of those Canadian paths are being traced again in mourning, a form of dark pilgrimage. Both Ian McIntosh and Matthew Anderson are fully aware of the Camino model and what it can offer as an indicator, as a guidepost, as a sample, as a foretaste of what they may create in a different form in other countries. But there's also simple tourism that intimates elevation to intentional travel of a deeper sort. Nation states are newly aware that pilgrimage is the most recession-proof form of discretionary travel. I'll say that again. Nation states are newly aware that pilgrimage is the most recession-proof form of discretionary travel. The deeper the values it channels, the greater the vehicle for cultural preservation, projection to a planetary audience, and substantial economic benefits. Pilgrimage to Zapopan in Jalisco, Mexico, with up to 2 million participants. The Hajj to Mecca with about 2.5 million. The Jewish observances at Mount Meron in northern Israel with several 100,000 are lively examples of the various styles of sacred travel. The Camino de Santiago seems to boast of something over 300,000 certifiable pilgrims per year, those who actually check in with the cathedral office and receive a document of completion. The real impact is far greater, of course. Many never present themselves because they are rushed, feel awkward because they are not Catholic, unaware of the formality, or who have done multiple treks and only got a certificate the first time. One estimate of today's undercount of arrivals places it at about 30%. Thousands more do partial Camino treks, assembling their pilgrimage over months or years. And how to count the tens and hundreds of thousands who arrive in Santiago by tour bus, train, or an airplane. Almost all check out the cathedral and are welcomed as good faith pilgrims. So these are our tasks for today. First, how did the Camino come to be? Second, how it flourished as a medieval reality and now promises a recovery of medieval experience. And third, the Camino's new potency to frame spiritual quests and economic benefits, but also hints of cultural endurance, reconciliation, interfaith dialogue, and personal healing. So what's the story of the shrine of St. James? Santiago, Sanctus Jacobus Santiague, Santiago, is the Apostle St. James the Elder, the Greater. He has a little brother, by the way, John. Both were apostles of Jesus Christ. We read about them both in the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. If you separate the history from the legends, on the historical side, we know that the Apostle James, Santiago, was martyred around the year 44 of the Common Era. But there are legends as well that James had actually preached in Iberia, went out to Iberia, modern Spain, preached the gospel and good news of Jesus Christ, and returned to Palestine, where he was martyred. After his martyrdom, the story goes that his disciples took the severed head and the body and boarded a boat and floated back somehow, miraculously, all the way to northwest Spain, where they reverently buried the body to lay undiscovered for almost 800 years. Well, a tomb was discovered in northwest Spain somewhere in the 820 to 830, and by a monk who was walking by night, saw a play of lights, stars, over a burial ground, informed the bishop, who set up an exploratory commission. They came out on expedition, they excavated, and they found what they declared to be the tomb of St. James the Apostle. Well, that play of lights becomes part of the legendary stories attached to the history of St. James. It goes on to formulate epic renditions and miracle tales of the favors that St. James showed after his death and after the discovery of his tomb. Much later, during international conflicts, Sir Francis Drake attacked Spain, actually burnt the shipyards at Cadiz, and was threatening to make a strike against Santiago itself to destroy the cathedral and destroy the relics. And so the relics were hidden so well and for so long that even the custodians of the shrine did not know where they were. They were lost somewhere on the premises, somewhere in Santiago. And Santiago, the saint, his relics were simply there somewhere, and his spirit floated above the city. Those relics were rediscovered in 1879 during excavations in the cathedral. And so for hundreds of years, the relics of St. James, what was reputed to be the relics of St. James, were hidden, their location unknown, and they're rediscovered. What happened was that a new bishop, very ambitious, and one of the canons of the cathedral, a German-trained archaeologist, decided to do what they called, for publicity purposes, house cleaning. And so they explored within the sanctuary of the cathedral, test digs where the bones might be buried. And during those excavations by López Ferrero, he recalled that as a canon of the cathedral, the entire canons and celebrants of the cathedral would march out of the sacristy and stop in a certain spot in the center behind the main altar and sing a hymn to St. James. There's no liturgical reason to do this, actually. It's a curious bit of local practice. But Raiders of the Lost Ark, Lopez decides this may be our clue to where the relics are actually buried. And that's where he dug, where the canons of the cathedral would sing their hymn to St. James. And indeed, he finds a marble box with the remains of 3 men. Well, who are they? And what actually do they have? After the relics were discovered, the Catholic Church, the cathedral, did something no one in Christendom, no one in the Catholic tradition had ever done before. They consulted the forensic staff at the medical school at the University of Santiago de Compostela, showed them all the bone fragments and asked them, well, what do we have? There are a lot of stray fragments. Apparently, when Francis Drake threatened attack, they collected all the relics and bones at the cathedral and put them in one place with St. James. But they were able to separate out the bones of 3 men, a younger man, and 2 older men, putatively James and 2 companions. After much research, the Pope himself, Leo XIII, issued a papal bull, a very formal and authoritative document, in November of 1884, declaring that, yes, pilgrimage to Santiago should resume to reverence St. James there. Of course, the papal bull is very cagey about what it affirms, and it keeps on saying, according to legend, according to popular tradition, according to the stories that have come down to us, all of this happened. So they repeat and compile the legends without actually saying that's exactly what happened. Actually, that archaeology revealed surprising results. Jose Suarez Otero and other archaeologists of great fame have been able to identify the remains, the base level of what's really a 1st or 2nd century Roman mausoleum that was repurposed as a Christian burial site. If you look at the inside, and these pictures are from the Museum of Pilgrimages in Santiago, this reconstruction shows you a lower chamber and an upper chamber, and the lower chamber would have had marble boxes with the remains of those buried within the mausoleum. It was repurposed as a Christian burial site. An altar was put in the upper chamber. Is it actually the remains of St. James? We don't know that, but Catholics would say that it's not so much a tomb as a lens. This is where things come into focus, and we venerate St. James. And that works perfectly well. And actually, historically too, when early Christians left Palestine, they took their books and their relics with them, give them a few hundred years to cross North Africa along the Mediterranean, and eventually work their way up. It's entirely possible that they could have brought remains of saints with them, and as far as Galicia. And here's a last view of the burial chamber, the Roman mausoleum that actually is under the main altar in Santiago de Compostela, much truncated. We don't know how much survived and for how long, but now it's just the foundational walls and outline. Which brings us to the Camino de Santiago as a pilgrimage route. It flourished throughout the Middle Ages, especially that main route out of France, the Camino Francaise. It's the Camino de los Francos, the free men, who were free to travel on their own, not vassals tied to the land and forbidden to leave their liege lord. But they traveled across northern Spain, eventually arriving in Santiago de Compostela. Which brings us to the Codex Calixtinas, or the Book of St. James. This is the most famous copy of the Codex Calixtinas. It's 12th century. It contains liturgy, legends, a tale, an epic tale of Charlemagne's adventures in Spain with his nephew Roland, famous from French epics. This book was and of course, the 5th book is a pilgrim's guide that tells you how to travel to Santiago. The famous Codex Calixtinas was certainly composed by French clerics, many of them Cluniac monks, who not only made the trek to Galicia, but increasingly populated the route with their monasteries. They were intent on encouraging travel, yes, religious tourism, to the shrine of St. James, and largely wrote this compilation of liturgy, music, and legends. There is a very literary and entirely fictional account of Charlemagne's and Roland's expeditions in Spain. It's called the Historia Turpini. That's the page you see here. Native Spaniards hardly make an appearance in the book. The wonderful Codex Calixtinas is a pious and glossy travel brochure to encourage the French to visit Compostela. I like to teasingly call the manuscript a Trojan horse full of French monks, but they did their job well. and helped propel Santiago to share top billing with Jerusalem and Rome, bracketing the Mediterranean with 3 Christian access points. The main route within Spain picked up the name of the Camino Francaise, or French route, and it's actually that route out of France and along many of the highways inside Iberia were marked with multiple foreign settlements called Via Franca, although that really meant free man's town. No matter, the main European land routes did pass through France, which heavily influenced the experience of all the German and Danish and Italian and English and Hungarian and Czech and other pilgrims who walked or rode to Santiago. Even those who came by sea often stopped at French ports and continued overland to Santiago. Now, of course, the marked trails to Santiago are incredibly vast. This is from the Instituto Geográfico Nacional in Spain. These are the modern contemporary 21st century trails in various countries that will point you toward Santiago. There's over 100,000 kilometers of Camino signage with Friends of the Camino associations, which provide assistance and hospitality within their countries and territories. This is a terrific boon to pilgrimage and tourism for all of these countries. All these volunteer organizations urging local and distance traffic and encouraging walkers, bikers, and also motoring visitors. It's a dream come true for tourism officials, as well as those who are religiously minded or merely longing for a personal spiritual quest. The tensions between commercialism and the pure experience are real. We're always there and can never go away. When people ask me, who are the pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago now? We have to admit there's everything on the Camino de Santiago, from what we jokingly call industrial strength Catholics to mainline denominations, to bearers of aromas, crystals, and grudges against their former churches. We even admit that there are people pissed at God for not existing, and they too are welcome as pilgrims. So what do I do now? I try to take people on the Camino de Santiago through all these lenses, through all these personal quests. We look for the quest in the guest. Pilgrimage has never been a good vehicle for dogmatizing. What pilgrims do on the trail, in conversation with each other, is formulate a consensus spirituality that is really open to all. So we pass through towns like Pamplona, which may be in fiesta, with college students in costume, cabezones, coming through the streets to greet us. We pass near Nájera, a sawmill with a cyclone fence where pilgrims had picked up scraps of bark and threaded them through the cyclone fence, the chicken wire, leaving crosses to mark their passage. These tokens of pilgrim passage are common in every culture. Pilgrims stay at shelters like this one in Greenia, where they politely leave their boots. My boots are there someplace. Leave their boots and socks in an open window, so as not to really stink up the sleeping quarters. But that too becomes gestures of mutual care. People on the Camino de Santiago really tend to each other in both emotional and even physical intimacy, entirely chaste, but in a very caring way. And the final approach into Santiago de Compostela is a beautiful one through Eucalyptus Forests, which are both silent and fragrant. And those looking for a mystical experience, an uplift to their spirits, often find it in those eucalyptus forests in Galicia. Along the way, we cross the Cruz de Ferro, where, by tradition, a pilgrim leaves a stone behind, representing their sins and their burdens. It's the highest physical point of the trek to Santiago in the Camino Francaise. And since Roman times, people traveling through there would toss a stone onto a pile to mark the high point of their passage. Now it represents so much more, and those who leave a stone behind travel on to Santiago lighter and feeling forgiven. These are the trails to Santiago across, in this case, La Rioja. They're beautiful and they're open and they're groomed and they're well tended and the signage is good. And when you get to Santiago, you will have followed the ancient medieval cruceros or markers that guide you along your way. There are modern pilgrims as practical hikers, and there are people who also dress in costume. I'm not going to make fun of that. People who dress in costume, who equip themselves with some of the accessories of pilgrimage, are doing it in good faith, trying to live a reality that was once medieval and is now modern, and perhaps some of both in our modern world. There are roof tours of the cathedral with its magnificent Baroque towers. The cathedral itself has recently been thoroughly cleaned and prepped for the Holy Year. It's glorious, new lighting, refreshed sculpture at the Pórtico de la Gloria. What we forget is that any medieval person entering this space would be dizzy with the volume of space, interior space, that they would never experienced anywhere else in their lifetime. And finally, under the main altar is this 19th century reliquary in silver, where the bones of St. James now repose under the main altar. So quickly, what are some of the major differences between medieval and modern pilgrimage to Santiago? We might as well log them in because professional medievalists and even tour promoters should note that there's massification, canalization, gentrification, sanitation, secularization, and chastity. The massification is unavoidable to notice. There are thousands and thousands of people on the Camino every day. Solitude is hard to come by. We sometimes joke that the traffic jam of walkers on the Camino de Santiago is worse than on the Beltway around Madrid. But there's canalization too. That is to say, there is a one certified route that leads you to Santiago from different starting points. The medieval routes would have spanned wide territories, necessarily because of the carrying capacity of the land, could not feed hundreds of thousands of non-productive visitors. The gentrification is there too, as those trails are groomed. There are picnic tables. There's lighting, night lighting for night walkers. There are no night walkers in the Middle Ages. There only are now. It becomes a little too refined for some. The sanitation I can't complain about, because in the Middle Ages, going on pilgrimage was a horror show. It's axiomatic in the Middle Ages that the rich had doctors and the poor had pilgrimage. So going on pilgrimage in the Middle Ages, many people were actually looking for a cure for some disease. And gosh, it would have been a very grisly display of human weakness, defect, disease, injury. Nowadays, people don't do the Camino until they're really in good shape, even buff. And I can't complain about that safety net. The secularization is also true, that many people are welcomed onto the Camino, whatever their faith background or none at all. And the chastity is an odd one. The signage is good. You can't get lost, although, well, you can. I have several times, but you are guided along the way. The safety net is good, even though my students sometimes do field surgery that I don't endorse. It's hard to take people on the Camino de Santiago because their personal health regimen is not always the best. They really do need to hydrate, hydrate, hydrate. And the secularization, the sharing of community life is really wonderful. And the chastity, the screen is blank on purpose. You can use your imagination. Why chastity? Because pilgrims share physical and emotional intimacy in the most chaste way possible for weeks on end, as we really tend to each other's spirits. People don't hit on each other while being a pilgrim. I recently learned that there are distractions on the internet that make walking 500 miles for a hookup unnecessary. Who knew? But now I think the chastity is actually a way to unplug from the modern society in a wonderful way. Goethe is supposed to have said that Europe was born of pilgrimage and Christendom is its mother's tongue. I'd like to turn that on its head, because it's not just Europe, it's not just Christendom. Pilgrimage is a host environment for internationalism and a broadening spirit. And the Camino de Santiago is one of our best models for how that can happen. If I personally, as a medievalist, have a late career campaign regarding pilgrimage, it's to encourage dialogue among the principal stakeholders who sometimes see each other, if not as enemies, then at least as cross purposes. And here are the stakeholders. There's those pure pilgrims at one end who see themselves as the true lived expression of a given pilgrimage. They seek an experience free of material trappings, enforced structure, commerce, and even dogma. They walk, they gesture, they perform, they voluntarily submit themselves to rites they may have no rationale for. They can be both submissive and intolerant. Along the way, these travelers deal with countless hosts and service providers from whom they make small purchases and receive instructions for that moment, that phase of their journey. These intermediaries willingly interact with visitors and seek to complement their quest as it gains focus. They try to be responsive to their visitors' daily demands, shifts in taste and spirit. Everyone accepts that these are negotiated exchanges. Everyone enters and departs with their autonomy and agency intact. You can see I'm talking like a person in tourism management now, but that's something we have to make our peace with if we want to preserve the Camino de Santiago as a world model. On arrival, pilgrims interact with and follow the directions of the custodians of the shrine sites, who are often vastly outnumbered, but are also considered and consider themselves the legitimate stabilizers of the site's meaning. They may dispense the artifacts the traveler seeks as mementos. Government officials may exercise authority over the physical traffic, protecting it, promoting it, taxing it. Their assumed role is to provide protection and safety net for travelers in trouble. There are tour promoters who are trying to make a buck. They're vaguely aware that they shouldn't kill the goose that's laying the golden eggs, but long-term planning is not their strong suit. And finally, there are scholars and observers whose formal posture is detachment, even if they are enthusiasts for the journey and its benefits. They contribute historical perspectives and can document changes in specific practices and beliefs. They may be archivists or participant ethnographers, theologians or dietitians, exercise physiologists, or epidemiologists. Like most intellectuals, they are valuable resources, if hard-pressed to get any of the other 5 stakeholders to listen to them. in time to make improvements. And right now, we should give special credit to planners in Galicia who have passed regulations about pilgrim trails, their design and safety. So let me just talk about some of the modern trails in other places. I have deep respect for Professor Quinn Moore of Charleston, South Carolina, who is right now, as we speak this afternoon, is on Ireland's National Famine Way with its workhouse and graveyard, helping to document a new pilgrimage trail separating the Irish potato famine. They have statues celebrating medieval pilgrims, but also along this trail, showing connections to these pilgrims who actually went to Santiago. You'll notice the scallop shell, the emblem of Santiago pilgrimage. Who gets to decide these types of pilgrimages about their authenticity and presentation moment? Well, Santiago, what's the presentation moment? Well, it's Compostela in the 9th or 12th or Baroque 18th century. Lourdes in Fatima prefers its moments of visions. Where I live in colonial Williamsburg, it's the 1770s on the eve of the revolution. So people are dressed in colonial era Virginia costumes. That authenticity and presentation moment, signage and branding, proof of accomplishment, self-awarded trophies, balkanization. Who gets to decide authenticity? Well, the shrine custodians. And the presentation moment, shrine custodians and promoters. And the signage and branding, government and shrine custodians and the tour promoters. Proof of accomplishment comes from the shrine custodians, the Compostela, versus self-awarded trophies, frankly, your blog site and your Facebook page, and the book that you write that's labeled My Camino. That can be sort of a self-awarded trophy for your venture. And the balkanization, well, it's the pilgrims who get fought over. No, come with me on a gastronomy tour. No, come with me on a self-improvement tour. No, come with me on a spiritual journey. There is going to be conversations that we need to have about who decides what. There's legal, social, medical status of foreign nationals. There's the mechanics of travel and survival for sacred travelers. There's death on pilgrimage, which is not common along the Camino de Santiago, but is in other pilgrimages. There's the sensory environment, which is now being cultivated and curated in new ways. And I'd like to recognize Manuel Sanchez, Jose Sanchez from the Cathedral of Santiago, with whom we wrote The Rattle of Time and Travel, trying to recover the acoustics of medieval pilgrimage. There's peace building as well along sectarian frontiers, where borders bunch up, where there have been tensions, but pilgrimage traffic can help ease those tensions. There's the apoliticization of the pilgrimage mindset among religious groups. There's the functions of lived religion and what you're allowed to participate. Compared to liturgical and paraliturgical practices, who gets to bathe in the waters of Lourdes? For whom is it appropriate? There's family dynamics, a new book by my colleague Kathleen Jenkins on family dynamics of those who walk as parents and children versus the aloneness of the solitary pilgrim. There's the very business of skepticism and buy-in. Do I really believe what I've heard about Santiago, about Mecca, about Rome, about Jerusalem? There are political shrines as well, bastions of nationalist ethnic retrenchment. That's pilgrimage, secular, political, patriotic pilgrimage of a different sort. but with an overlapping model and ethos. It's also a theater for therapeutic intervention. And quickly, I'll run through these. Americans are now more appreciative of who we are as a pilgrim nation, often using the Camino de Santiago to understand our sites of religious pilgrimage, our journeys of religious pilgrimage, how Protestant traditions, not Catholic, but Protestant, explored a new continent and now are trying to recover ancient Christian practice of pilgrimage. The Mormons are a good example with their 3,000-mile trek to Salt Lake City. And now we have entire movies about the Camino de Santiago, which inspired not only that pilgrimage, but other parallel experiences as well. There are universities dedicated to studying pilgrimage in a formal way, certainly at William and Mary, at York University, and beautifully, Miguel Taín Guzman, the institutional chair at the University of Santiago de Compostela, has a magnificent operation there. There are publications like Ad Limina and Francisco Singul's El Camino que Vence al Tiempo. There's pilgrimage in Canada and Celtic pilgrimage. Matthew Anderson is an excellent example of people who are exploring this now. There are fabulous new books about pilgrimage in the 21st century, both the Camino de Santiago and its parallels in other nations and in other models. There's a fine book actually on tourism, curating the pilgrimage to the Camino de Santiago by Michael Murray. There's even a children's book called Walk, which actually gets everything right for the Camino de Santiago for readers in their early teens. And finally, Pachi Perez Armayo, a good friend in Spain, who is unearthing pilgrim cemeteries and burials, and who can tell where they're from, what their diet was growing up, if they suffered disease or trauma, and whether they were outbound from Central Europe or homebound after benefiting from a healthy, high-protein seafood diet, which shows up in their very bones, even after hundreds of years. Pachi has allowed me to speak on this topic here in the United States, communicating some of his research. I call it dining and dying on the way to Santiago, pilgrim cemeteries. Fascinating research, brand new. And Mary Jane Dunn is reminding us now that it's no longer the goal, it's the journey itself. One should enter the journey on your GPS and not just the destination. So if you're thinking of doing Pamplona this year, do it along the Camino de Santiago. Enjoy the culture, yes, the gastronomy and the wine, but enjoy most of all your fellow pilgrims and the stories that they have to tell. And as long as we're speaking about death with Pachi Perez Armayo and pilgrim cemeteries, I can tell you that the truth that we seek along pilgrimage is really universal and to be taken lightly. Our intuitions are always open to the revision of other pilgrims' intuitions. And so we look for truth. We come back sometimes in laughter. And with that, I should really say this is my last PowerPoint on the topic for today. And I want to thank everyone for their patience, their goodwill. And I invite you to ask any questions you'd like in the chat area. So thank you very much, Marta, and everyone at the Instituto Cervantes and its Observatorio. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for this fascinating overview and comprehensive overview of the history of the Camino, this marvelous comparison between medieval and modern pilgrimage, your taxonomy of today's pilgrims. It's been fascinating, honestly. So let's invite the people present here today to ask their questions or make comments or observations that you would like to make. You can either write them through the chat if you are willing to, or ask them yourselves orally, and you can ask them you can make your comments or questions in either Spanish or English, and Professor Greenia will probably answer in English so that everybody can understand. But if anybody would like to ask anything in Spanish, you're welcome to. So would anybody like to ask anything? Are there any? Let me just check if there are any questions. Yeah. So there's William, who's asking about the differences with modern pilgrimage. Yes, you can. Yes, please, William, go ahead.
Thank you very much, George, for that wonderful presentation. I was very impressed by your list of differences between medieval and modern pilgrimage. And most of them I expected: the massification, the gentrification, the sanitation, the secularization. What I didn't expect was your last one, chastity. Now, I have encountered this concept before. In France, on the route from Le Puy to Santiago, there is a little town called Estaing, and there is a community of former pilgrims who, after having made their pilgrimage, discerned it was their calling to receive other pilgrims. I stayed there on my pilgrimage. Once I'd reached Santiago, I began going back to help there as an hospitalier. Now, they said to me once that for them it's important that their hospitality to pilgrims does not involve, or they try to avoid, any sort of holding on to the pilgrims, keeping them attached to that place. And the word they used, they said, it teaches us to be more chaste in our relationship with these pilgrims. Now, chastity, sort of in its specific meaning, is the virtue concerned with sex. But of course, it has a wider meaning of, avoiding sort of implicating others in one's own workings. So I'd encountered that, and you mentioned it in your presentation. But why do you mention it specifically as a difference between modern pilgrimage and medieval? I mean, sure, there are in the medieval literature accounts of pilgrims who acted in an unchaste way, but surely most of the hospitality given to pilgrims in the Middle Ages was chaste. So why do you mention it specifically now?
I mention it specifically because in the Middle Ages, we know that there was a lot of misbehavior, even though there was a presumption of ritual purity in various gestures. You may not bathe, you may not cut your hair or fingernails for the entire journey. There are ways of marking yourself out of normal performance. Of course, if you're gone 2, 4, 6, 8 months away from your legitimate sex partner and away from the governing control of your village, things happen along the Camino. And we've got the sermons to prove it, that people are not supposed to misbehave sexually on the Camino. People did, and they sought forgiveness for it. There are all sorts of strictures against women staying more than a single night in a tavern, 2 nights at most, if they're ill and need to rest along the Camino. They didn't want any women setting up operation in a pilgrim inn or tavern along the way. Nowadays, we sometimes joke about Santiago de Compostela. There's only 3 prostitutes in the entire city, and we know them by name. Don't ask me how I know. The thing is, pilgrim crowds are no longer good traffic areas for prostitution. There's still a residual sense of ritual purity, of good behavior. People do hook up on the Camino de Santiago and other pilgrimages, but there's an awareness that they leave the pilgrimage trail. They are no longer pilgrims when they're engaged in those pastimes and activities. So chastity, including your sense, William. William Griffiths, by the way, is a great authority on the Camino de Santiago, Lourdes, and other pilgrimages. Not clinging to people, not scripting their experience is part of the modern experience and part of the discipline that we try to impose on ourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the really good question. Very interesting question. Any other questions? Would anybody like to ask anything else or comment?
I would certainly
I
invite.
have a question myself, George.
Please.
Two questions, in fact, if there are no other questions from the audience. Why is the route from Oviedo to Santiago called the primitive route? You know this saying that I've come from Oviedo, you know this saying that people from Asturias say, quien va a Santiago y no al Salvador, which is the Oviedo Cathedral, Salvador, because it's devoted to the Savior, visita al criado y no a su señor. He who goes to Santiago and not to Oviedo visits the serf and not the Savior. So in Asturias, people boast about our route being the primitive, if I'm not mistaken. Could you explain that, if it is correct, or if it's just, again, legend? Or...
No, it's perfectly historical that after the discovery of the tomb of St. James in Galicia, the bishop, Teodomiro, in Galicia, Iria Flavia, nearby, next to Padron on the coast, invited the king of Asturias to come down in formal recognition of the tomb site. And the route that king Alfonso took is called the Primitivo because it was the first of all pilgrimage routes from the ancient Asturian capital in Oviedo to Santiago. So legitimately, it's the Primitivo as the first of the routes, okay. Even though over the passage of time, the French route bore more traffic, at least by land, but there are routes up from Portugal, certainly the English route, which came down from Ferrol and La Coruña, which it's called the English route, but it's the English and Irish and actually Norwegian and Danish route as people landed in La Coruña and walked on to Santiago. Mm-hmm. Actually, they seem to have rented horses and rode on rented animals down to Santiago and then back again. William Way makes the trip in such a short order, practically overnight, that he must have been on a rented horse to make the trip so quickly. That's mid-15th century. So the primitive route deserves its name historically as one of the first originally designated route to Santiago.
Oh, good. So we can be proud of that then in Asturias.
Yes.
And it's supposed to be very, I haven't done it, but it's supposed to be very hard, a very hard one, yeah? Difficult, yeah? Mm. Any questions? And I was catching up on what the quote by Goethe on the saying that pilgrimage is Europe's mother tongue. I suppose mother tongue was being used in a metaphorical way there, but I would now like to refer to languages, to the relationship between pilgrimage, in particular this pilgrimage, or well, any other, and language development. Are there any studies on how the Camino de Santiago influenced the development of the vernacular tongues, Spanish, Galician, Portuguese, French, Portuguese? Are there any studies from this perspective of the impact on this important cultural, historical, religious phenomenon on language development?
Certainly. In the Middle Ages and in our modern era as well, excuse me, the multilingualism of pilgrimage by its nature formed its own professional cadre. That's to say, in Rome, in Jerusalem especially, and certainly in Santiago, there were competent speakers of French, of German, of English, of Italian, who could provide guide services for those newly arrived from those countries. And certainly the traffic along the trail favored the propagation of Latin and the vernaculars in their growth. So those who traveled to Santiago got an exposure to multiple languages. If you live in a small medieval village all of your life, the people in the next village spoke funny. And the further you went, the funnier they spoke, until finally you couldn't understand them at all. But the hardening of linguistic frontiers is really a matter of the late 15th, early 16th century, the rise of nationalism and national borders. Before then, everyone was multilingual, could make do in varieties of Romance, especially.
Thank you. How interesting.
Can I
So we
throw
have
in a
some
few-
comments now. Sorry, anybody would? Let me just
Yeah,
read.
can I throw in Steve's working. Can I throw in a few words on what George just said?
Yes,
Uh,
go ahead.
Yeah, there were a lot of pilgrimage played an important role in the development of the Spanish lexicon in the Middle Ages, because many of the pilgrims came from France, and many of them stayed in Spain. They got to Santiago, then instead of going back home, they stayed and established what were often called these barrios góticos, I think, in various cities like Pamplona, Stadia, up in Navarre, and a lot of medieval French vocabulary, especially from the south and the north of France, entered Spanish probably through language contact. You take a word like maison, which is a Gallicism based on the French word maison, etc. So there's quite a lot of that. So yes, there was an influence. Mainly French borrowings are the ones that entered the Spanish language at that time as a result of the pilgrimages. There were other reasons for French borrowings as well, other than the pilgrimage, but that certainly played a role.
Thank you. Thanks so much. George, you're on mute. Yeah.
I should recognize Stephen Dworkin as one of the greatest historians of the Spanish language, recently retired from the University of Michigan. And I'm proud to say one of my professors when I was studying as a graduate student, Stephen Dworkin. Please look up his publications. They truly are monumental.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the publicity, George. There's a chapter on Gallicisms in my book on the history of the Spanish lexicon.
Great, thank you.
There are two comments here. One is from Amanda Norse. I think she's from Harvard. And she says the Vuelta a España, the cycling race, this year was pilgrimage themed, starting in the Burgos Cathedral and ending in Santiago de Compostela rather than in Madrid, which is the usual finish. So that's a special thing. And then Julie Gianelloni Connor asks, how many people would walk the Camino per year in the Middle Ages? And she says, I've heard the numbers were very high, rivaling pre-COVID numbers. Your massification difference then would indicate that it is not true.
The traffic along the medieval Camino de Santiago was steady, but it was not enormous. We didn't have the canalization. There's no one path like you see over my shoulder here. The carrying capacity of the land to produce foodstuffs for a large population was very limited. They didn't have the transportation to move food onto the Camino. These people did not help produce food as travelers. They just consumed it. Excuse me. Some people did winter over, help with a harvest, prolong their journey as a day laborer. But for the most part, they're consuming without producing. That's why, what do pilgrims survive on? Nuts. They're light. They're produced in abundance. Eggs. They don't deplete. Giving an egg away, frankly, you can eat it raw or cooked in a variety of ways. Doesn't deplete your reproductive stocks. There's no fighting about portion control. His is bigger than mine. No, most eggs are about the same size. But 100,000 pilgrims a year, I doubt it. But the traffic is steady, especially in the off seasons for agriculture. Midsummer, but not planting and harvest seasons.
Interesting. And Joseph Rega, our RA, asks whether you could discuss, if you could discuss the ecological impact of the Camino.
Wow. Actually, I had a student once do ecosystems on the Camino, actually river systems on the Camino. Pilgrims are great tourists, a very highly desirable form of tourism because we tend to be very gentle on the land. We don't tend to litter. We're not mindless consumers. Actually, we are green travelers more so than other forms of visitors. So that's another reason why pilgrims are a valued commodity in the tourist world. We don't spend that much, but we're there for longer. And we don't consume madly. We don't leave a lot of plastic and trash in our wake. If anything, we try to keep the Camino clean for others. The sense of social responsibility is higher among pilgrims. And so, frankly, we're a better class of tourists in many ways. And I sort of like that designation.
Mm-hmm. Any more comments or questions? Would you like to ask any of your colleagues a question, George?
I would invite Jose Sanchez or Jose Suarez Otero if they would like to say something. There are two great authorities. Jose Suarez Otero is one of the great archaeologists of Galicia. Jose Sanchez, my co-author on the acoustic study of medieval travel, is the Archivo Técnico from the Cathedral of Santiago. If either of them would like to offer, si quieren darnos una palabra, una perspectiva, una sugerencia de lo que ellos saben mejor que yo, me encantaría escuchar su voz.
Is willing to, Jose Sanchez. So go ahead, you can, tiene la palabra. Jose.
Muchas gracias. Yeah, hi everybody. It was a great talk, just like always you speak. We always learn something. I'm working now, especially on time, on the perception of time in Middle Ages, in pilgrimage, in Jacobean pilgrimage, in the pilgrimage to Santiago. It's difficult to find these references, but I think, well, you spoke just a little bit, but I think we can, maybe you can see the same perception of time in the pilgrim, both in Middle Ages, maybe not in the whole Middle Ages, because in the whole Middle Ages, we don't have, I presume we don't have the same perception of time. I would leave that for other works, but the same perception of time in the pilgrims in late Middle Ages than today. The pilgrimage begins when you are preparing your travel, not even when you're walking, maybe when you're at home yet, preparing the travel and thinking about that and waiting maybe for the right moment to begin your way. It's maybe the extension of time. It's not a present, it's an extensive present for the pilgrimage. And in some ways, and some maybe then we have to go deep on motivations, but it's not, the most important thing is not being here in Compostela, but the traveling that you make coming here and even coming and even going back home. I think, what do you think, George? I'm sure we will talk about that because I will request for your help. But what do you think about that sense of perception of time, both in Middle Ages and today, in that time, in that sense of the long time for the pilgrim, not walking, but even at home, just preparing the travel. And thank you for your talk. It was terrific as always.
Jose Sanchez is doing brilliant work right now and just received a major grant from the University of Santiago to work on the perception of time for medieval travelers. And he is absolutely right that the perception of time within your home frame environment is different because it's regulated by interaction with known factors, your family, your livestock, who needs to be fed when, also your local church bells, the cycle of liturgical life within your village. So you have a much more softly regulated time experience at home. Once you set out on the road, it's the sun that's your major timepiece. That's true at home as well, but all the other markers of domestic routine, of labor, of social interaction within your village are gone. So going on pilgrimage, you step into a foretaste of eternity. And that's part of this spiritual experience that you lend yourself to. Every place you stop, at shrines, at monasteries, at churches, at shelters like that, time pools around you again. Time collects around you. You step back into human time, regulated time. And it can be glorious when you come to Santiago de Compostela and the bells are ringing, announcing things, when there's trumpet blasts giving legal announcements and formal announcements, when there's curfew, toque de queda, when you are obliged, the city gates are shut, time imposes itself in new ways and may disorient the traveler. So José Sanchez's work on the perception of time in the Middle Ages is really groundbreaking work, and I'm looking forward to reading his new research in that area.
I don't know whether José Suárez would like to say something. ¿Le gustaría decir algo, José Suárez Otero? Because you mentioned him as well, George.
Okay. Thank you, George. And a great lecture, as always. For me, it's difficult to participate because, my topic is the most sensitive topic in this pilgrimage. It's about the origins, about the reasons for the St. James cult in Compostela. Then it's very difficult to explain the problem around these origins, these difficult origins. My last theory put this origin in relationship with the Suevic kingdom and with the Christianization of Galicia as well. But for me, working as archaeologist, my research has obviously serious limits, serious handicaps, because the archaeological remains in the cathedral, below the cathedral, are very, very disturbed along the centuries, and it's very difficult to interpret these remains in order to explain the origin and more the reason for this cult. But anyway, the origin was real, and the origin was in relationship with the Christianization, maybe not so old than they think in the 9th century, but real and very interesting to understand the problem of the Christianization of Europe in the transition between the Antiquity and the Middle Age. And so I can say at this moment about that. And in relation about the pilgrimage itself, real certain massification in Middle Age. There was because you you have to situate this amount of people in relationship with the people in this moment, in this historical moment. And in that moment, 1,000 people is real massification. Not now, of course, but at that moment, I say that in order to discuss people who thinks that their Middle Age pilgrimage was not important because the people are a few people, not a lot of people. But really, it was a lot of people in relation with the population of that moment. And then certain massification for that moment is as well possible, as well and real, especially in harbors. 1,000 people from Hamburg in one moment is a lot of people in 15th century.
Jose Suarez is absolutely right. If you look at Hispano-Roman at the end of the Roman Empire in Iberia, the population of Iberia is 6 or 7 million people. Now, Spain alone has about 45 million people. There were fewer people back then. And so, especially during the Crusades, if an expeditionary military force stops to visit the Cathedral of Santiago and has several hundred fighting men descend on the city, that's a lot of people to feed. That's a lot of economic activity. The importance of Santiago in Christendom, with constant envoys going back and forth between Santiago and Rome, builds two-way traffic. And don't forget, it's all two-way traffic in the Middle Ages. You don't arrive in Santiago and fly home. There's constant intersecting traffic encountering each other along the trails. So yes, a group of 20 is suddenly an influx that's noticeable and makes an impact on both economy and social interaction. Santiago was a real hub for international exchange. Thank you, Jose.
Thank you very much. There's a comment from Daphne Menel who says, I am always surprised by the open and generous hospitality of the Spanish to the pilgrims, despite the numbers. Is this something that is somehow a part of their culture? So what do you say? Or have you noticed a change, by the way, in Spaniards' attitude towards pilgrims throughout all these years? You have been a pilgrim.
I've been on the pilgrim trails for over 20 years. And actually, I've always found wonderful hospitality in Spain. There's a certain performance of good pilgrim, good host. And these are sincere performances. I want to be a good pilgrim. Others want to be a good host. Truthfully, the medieval records are full of cheating innkeepers, of murderous encounters, of death by wild animals and starvation and accident. Pilgrimage has never been safer, and frankly, has never been more hospitable. Spain is a wealthy country. It can afford to be generous, and it lends itself to this generosity. So I think the culture of hospitality has reignited itself in modern Spain and Portugal and France and England in a beautiful way. Never has charity been more freely given and more abundantly given. Never has pilgrimage been so safe, secure, and rewarding. For people who told me already 20 years ago, the Camino is dead, there's too many people. I told them then, and I tell them now, if you want an intimate experience, provide one for someone else. And we too, as pilgrims, are bearers, our vehicles, our vessels of charity for each other. we care for each other. And when we do, we provide that original pure experience of pilgrimage and hospitality for one another.
It's good to know. So we have to, thank you, George, for that answer. It's great to know that. So we have two more questions. One from Antonio Barbagallo, who would like to ask it himself. Hello, Antonio.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry, I had to get up just for a little bit to tend to my granddaughter's puppy. And so I might have missed something that you already spoke about. So forgive me in case you have already spoken about this. But I wanted to refer to the buildings that the Christians, the monarchy, the ancient monarchies of northern Spain built along the Camino. For example, the Romanesque churches that still remain, and also the shelters, which means that, as you have already mentioned, there was a substantial number of pilgrims. I don't know if you've talked about the architecture, and also I wanted to refer to ask actually, do you think that in some way this contact of northern Spain with Christian Europe, because let's not forget that most of Europe, most of Spain, most of the Iberian Peninsula was Muslim in the 9th century, 10th, 11th century. Still half of the peninsula was under the Muslims, and so I'm wondering if you feel that the pilgrimage somehow could have had an effect on the Reconquista, for example.
That's a very big question, involving first of all, the Muslims occupied and ruled the majority of the Iberian Peninsula for a long period. Their presence spans 800 years almost. That doesn't mean that everyone within their territories was Muslim. There were many Christians in the lower levels of society who lived among Muslims, paid additional taxes, did not enjoy the same sort of social mobility. Jews in their colonies under Muslim authority did exercise a good deal of social mobility, moving swiftly into the ranks of administration with their with Muslim authorities. Certainly, the keeping the Camino de Santiago and pilgrimage trails in Christian north of Iberia open and in communication with the rest of Christendom becomes a cause célèbre for Christians in the north to preserve their shrine sites. It's not just Santiago, it's Oviedo as well, of course. Eventually Montserrat comes into the foreground. There's a number of shrine sites in the north, major and minor, that are very important to Christians, and that traffic of Cluniac monks across the north in Sahagún, for instance, where they have major foundations. At one time, Spain has 100 foundations that are Cluniac in foundation, in history and ethos, not to mention other religious orders that increasingly populate the peninsula. So the interaction between Muslim and Christian populations, and there was a large Jewish population in A Coruña at one time. They produced the Kennecott Bible, now one of the treasures of England at the British Library, I believe. It recently returned for a visit to A Coruña. So interfaith medieval Spain is one of the great topics that we all celebrate, including interfaith presence. We even have Muslim accounts of Christians who went to Santiago de Compostela. And it's part of Almansor's dream of capturing Santiago as a decapitation strike against Christendom. If the Muslims can take Jerusalem and can take Santiago, it's almost a pincer movement against Rome in the middle. Santiago is one of the great axes of Christendom in the medieval world. So, and other people in North Africa are aware of that, and they see it. Later Protestant era, they recognize Santiago as one of the great Catholic sites. Sir Francis Drake wants to wipe it out as a way of attacking Rome. Rome is too far, too difficult. Santiago's within reach. So it becomes a target of opportunity, as the military would say. That interfaith churning is a tremendous history that we're working out slowly, and many people are doing wonderful work on precisely that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a last question. I think we can finish with this question by Professor Miguel Taín, who, as I said at the beginning, holds the chair of Pilgrim Studies and Studies on the Camino at the Universidad de Santiago de Compostela. Thank you very much, Professor Taín, for your presence and for your question. So the question is, George, what was the role of the first American pilgrims in the resurrection of the Way of St. James in the 20th and the 21st centuries? That's a really good question. To round up the event.
Well, certainly Americans have become enthusiasts about the Camino de Santiago and all things pilgrimage. We travel a lot. We love the Camino. We have a very large national association, American Pilgrims on the Camino, which does tremendous work in helping people go on the Camino, savor the experience once they return, and even offering tens of thousands of dollars for infrastructure improvements on the Camino de Santiago to help other pilgrims have adequate shelters. It starts perhaps with one of the greatest women pilgrims coming from America, and that's Georgiana Goddard King, art historian from a century ago, who produced a wonderful The Way of St. James. As an architectural historian, Miguel Taín is supervising a vast, important project to translate her into Spanish for the first time. It's taken a century, but it will be wonderful under Miguel's guidance. But she inspired others like Walter Starkey and eventually James Michener, who celebrated the Camino de Santiago and helped excite it in the American imagination. And now, when we go out to recover trails of historical significance for us, on the Trail of Tears, on the Underground Railroad, the Mormon Trek West, the Franciscan missions in California, Chimayo in New Mexico, well, we're often thinking about the model of the Camino de Santiago. So if there's one way to end this talk, it's a word of thanks on behalf of my nation to Spain for giving us an inspiration to review and rebuild some of our own history in America. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's our own thank you to all of North American pilgrims who have contributed so generously and so greatly to this knowledge of the Camino all over the world. I think we should also mention your friend and colleague, the late David Gittlich, shouldn't we, who died a few months ago, yes? Yes,
David Gittlich, the greatest scholar of pilgrimage in the Western Hemisphere, no exaggeration, did major books on the cultural itinerary of the Camino de Santiago and also on Jewish pilgrimage. He was Jewish himself, knew that intimately from the Sephardic tradition, but wrote on the Camino de Santiago. He helped pioneer the Camino de Santiago with American scholars like Lynn Talbot and Mary Jane Dunn, who have gone on to tremendous careers in scholarship on the Camino de Santiago. So David Gittlich, who died of COVID in Oaxaca, Mexico, last December 30th, an obituary for him does appear in the current issue of the journal Ad Limina, available free online for anyone who would like to read it. Thank you, Martha.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for your presence here. And thank you, especially to you, George. It's been wonderful. It's been wonderful meeting you and certainly meeting you. I hope we can meet personally sometime, either in Santiago or here in person at the Observatorio. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you so much.